When it comes to weapons in D&D, not all of them were created equal, and many are considered to be mechanically subpar. On top of this, the rulebooks don't provide us much detail on these weapons, leaving us to fill in the gaps of how our weapons look and feel. Due to this lack of information, I'd like to go through and examine all the weapons of D&D to answer: what is this weapon, both in history and in D&D? How is it different from the other weapons available? And does it need to be made better, and how can we do so? For today's video, let's look at a big bow that gave firearms a run for their money: the longbow. The longbow is a tall bow intended for hunting and warfare. Typically made from a single piece of wood, longbows would measure from 1.2 to 2.3 meters and have a draw weight between 60 and 185 pounds. Most European bows favored yew wood due to its higher strength, elasticity, and light weight, but cheaper hardwoods such as elm, oak, or ash could also be used. Other materials could also be laminated onto the wood to strengthen the bow, such as bamboo or leather. The string would historically be made of flax, linen, or hemp, but modern bows use synthetic polymers such as Dacron and Kevlar. The arrows fired from longbows were around 60 to 80 centimeters long, and while the arrowhead would vary depending on its intended use, military arrows commonly used the bodkin point arrowhead. The effective range of longbows is not accurately known, but it's estimated that the range of a medieval English longbow could be between 315 and 370 meters. For the Americans watching, that's just over 3 football fields long. When we look at the history of the longbow, we often think of the medieval period, but longbows can actually be traced back to the ancient period. In 1991, a yew longbow was discovered in the Ötztal Alps, dating back to the 4th century BC. Outside of rare finds in archaeology, though, we don't hear a lot about the longbow in the ancient period. This was likely due to a number of reasons, such as longbows requiring the right type of wood and having to be carved in a specific way, making it harder for craftsmen to even create one. Even once those discoveries were made, the longbow required far more training to use than a short bow or other ranged weapons of the time, largely due to its high draw weight. As a result, longbow usage in Europe didn't really pick up until the Middle Ages. It's actually a matter of debate as to whether the European longbow originated from the Welsh or the English. Archery had played a big part in Norman and Anglo-Norman warfare, and during the Anglo-Norman invasion of Wales in the 11th century, Welsh bowmen were proven to be extremely effective with longer bows made of elm. In 1188, historian Gerald of Wales recorded much about Welsh archers and their unique bows, stating, "In the war against the Welsh, one of the men-of-arms was struck by an arrow shot at him by a Welshman. It went right through his thigh, high up, where it was protected inside and outside the leg by his iron chausses, and then through the skirt of his leather tunic. Next, it penetrated that part of the saddle which is called the alva or seat, and finally it lodged in his horse, driving so deep that it killed the animal." The specifics on whether this bow was indeed a longbow or a different classification of bow is up in the air. What is agreed on, however, is that powerful longbows began to be used en masse by the English in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the English were using the longbow to great effect against the French in the Hundred Years' War. In Edward III's Declaration of 1363, he stated that every man in the country should learn and practice archery in his free time, in order to have more archers to draw from in times of war. This seems to have paid off, with one of the most famous successes of English longbowmen at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Longbows were not unique to Europe, however, and other cultures did develop their own versions of the longbow throughout history. In southern China, longbows were popular due to the humid climate, which made horn bows difficult to utilize. Excavated Chinese longbows have been found measuring 1.6 meters long, and are dated as far back as the Warring States period. In Japan, the yumi was an important weapon for samurai during the feudal period. Measuring over 2 meters long, it was used throughout the Sengoku period alongside matchlock firearms known as tanegashima. During the more peaceful Edo period of 1603 to 1867, the yumi took on a more spiritual and decorative role in Japanese society. Even with its widespread use, the longbow was not without its drawbacks. It was powerful, but needed to be set up in a defensive position to be effective. At the Battle of Patay in 1429, English longbowmen were caught out by French cavalry before they could prepare, leading to the destruction of the English army in France and the loss of many English commanders. On top of that, while the longbow's power and range were able to keep up with developments in armor, it required archers to train for long periods of time to develop the muscles and knowledge needed. Due to this specialized training, longbowmen were expensive to keep around in a standing army. Many decided to take the cost of their services elsewhere, becoming mercenaries in Italy and Spain. By the time of the 16th century, firearms had advanced significantly, introducing arquebusers and grenadiers to European battlefields. When guns entered the fray, they didn't require years of muscle training and marksmanship to penetrate heavier armor. Despite this, the English crown made efforts to keep the longbow relevant, such as introducing fines to homes that did not own a bow. Eventually, even the English had to trade their longbows for muskets, and the last recorded use of bows in an English battle was in 1642. Longbows remained in continuous production for sport and hunting from the 17th century into the modern era, but their draw weights were reduced significantly. These modern longbows find use in bow hunting as well as archery competitions, but serious military interest in the longbow faded after the 17th century. There is one record of its military use in a modern conflict, though. In 1940, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill deployed to France armed with a longbow, a basket-hilted Scottish sword, and a set of bagpipes. In May of that year, he and his men ambushed a German patrol near L'Epinette, and while he is credited with a longbow kill, Churchill later said that his bows had been crushed earlier in the campaign. Today, the longbow is a staple for medieval and fantasy media, showcasing its power and effectiveness whether it's being used against the French or the Fae. In D&D, the longbow is described as a two-handed martial ranged weapon of the bow family. Made of wood, horn, or bone, it's believed to have been invented by the elves and takes 5 years of training to become proficient with. Present since 1st edition, older versions of the longbow cost between 60 and 75 gold pieces, weighed 1.4 kilograms, and dealt 1d8 piercing damage. In 5th edition, the longbow costs 50 gold pieces, weighs 0.9 kilograms, deals 1d8 piercing damage, and has the ammunition, range, heavy, and two-handed weapon properties. As the martial upgrade to the short bow, the longbow flexes increased damage and range while adding the heavy property and costing double the gold of its shorter counterpart. While this makes it a less viable weapon for smaller races, the longbow still remains a fairly meta weapon option for ranged characters that want to maximize damage. While it may not deal 1d10 damage like the heavy crossbow we covered last week, it isn't impeded by the loading property, allowing it to fire as many shots as a character's action economy allows. Plus, when paired with feats like Sharpshooter, characters can pretend to be Legolas by firing at enemies up to 600 feet away with no disadvantage. All in all, the Longbow is an incredibly good weapon option in D&D so long as you're proficient with it. A staple for rangers and fighters, it really is the pinnacle of ranged weapons in D&D, and it's a personal favorite of mine when I'm min-maxing yet another variant human fighter with the Sharpshooter feat. The Longbow is one of those weapons that just feels right. It deals good damage, it pairs well with ranged feats without requiring too much investment, and it fits thematically with a lot of different character inspirations, from Legolas to Hawkeye to Katniss Everdeen. Trust me, the Longbow does not need help being any better in D&D. But with that being said, there is an argument to be made that it might be a bit too good. With how simplified a lot of combat mechanics became in 5th edition, a lot of the cool distinctions between weapons were lost, making combat easier for newer players to learn, but offering less depth in return. So, rather than leave the Longbow safely in the top spot, I'd like to go through some suggestions I had to keep it as a viable ranged weapon, but add some more unique features that help it not overshadow other weapons. My first suggestion is to reintroduce the crit distinctions between bows and crossbows from 3rd edition. Much like in 5th edition, 3rd edition bows did less potential damage than crossbows. However, bows would deal triple damage on a critical strike, whereas crossbows could crit on a natural 19 or natural 20. Having these added critical properties meant that players could choose whether they wanted to critically strike more often or do more damage when they do crit, adding greater depth to their weapon choice. If we brought this back for the Longbow, it would improve both bows and crossbows in unique ways, making all of them a little more fun across the board. My second suggestion on how to help the Longbow is to add more arrows that do different types of damage. As I've mentioned in previous videos, 5th edition sorely lacks the ability for martial characters to vary up their damage type. In fact, one of the only raw ways to shoot flaming arrows in D&D is to have a spellcaster use a 3rd level spell slot to enchant up to 12 arrows or bolts. What I propose is adding more arrow options that deal fire, poison, cold, or lightning damage instead of piercing. Now, a vial of poison, which can be used to coat up to 3 pieces of ammo to deal 1d4 extra poison damage, costs 100 gold pieces. Personally, I think that's a little steep for just 3 arrows, especially since 20 basic arrows only cost 1 gold piece. For this suggestion, why don't we split the difference and say that a bundle of 20 elemental arrows costs 50 gold pieces. This gives players a gold sink to spend their hard-earned money on, while also bringing ranged martial characters closer in power to spellcasters. Now, the obvious downside to this is that it makes spells like Flame Arrows or Lightning Arrow useless, but I personally think that adding this level of depth and variety to ranged weapons in D&D is well worth losing a couple of 3rd level spells. My third and final suggestion on how to make the Longbow more unique is to give it a weapon property that imposes disadvantage with the weapon while mounted. I know. It seems weird to propose a nerf to a weapon when you're claiming to fix it, but just hear me out. We all know that the Longbow is a bit too good as it is right now, and if you have proficiency with martial weapons, there's little to no reason to use a short bow instead of a longbow, despite these weapons having their own pros and cons historically. In conjunction with my suggestion to make the short bow better while mounted in that video, this cements the longbow as a great weapon for infantry, without overshadowing the short bow. Now, alternatively, you could also add the composite longbow back into the game, but I'll likely touch on that in a separate video on the weapons I want to add back into D&D. When I touched on this in my short bow video, I mentioned that granting the short bow advantage may be better than imposing disadvantage on other ranged weapons while mounted, as players might respond better to rewards than punishments. I do think that there's some flexibility within this suggestion to work out how that relationship with mounted ranged combat would work, but that's probably an entire video in of itself. For now, I think establishing the longbow as a weapon for unmounted characters helped solidify it as a good infantry choice, while still letting the short bow shine for mounted characters. With all of that being said, these are just a few of my own suggestions on how to keep the longbow viable, while also giving it a more distinct role within the ranged weapons roster. If we left it alone, the longbow would continue to be a staple for ranged characters in D&D, and I don't think that's a bad thing. It is iconic for a reason after all, but these suggestions just offer up some alternative ideas to continue adding depth to the game without overcomplicating things too much. With that, we come to the end of today's video on the longbow. As popular in fantasy media as it was in England, the longbow is a mandatory weapon addition to any game claiming to be medieval fantasy. While its implementation in 5th edition makes it the top dog by default, we can still tweak its crit mechanics, ammo types, and relationship with mounts to keep it good while not making it the objectively best weapon in every scenario. However, what I want to know is, what do you think of the longbow? Do you think it's fine as is? Did you like some of the suggestions I put forward, or did you have your own ideas on how to fix the longbow in D&D? You can let me know down in the comments, or you can discuss it on the Alt-Roll Discord using the link in the description. If you want to support Alt-Roll, you can visit our Ko-fi to leave a one-time or recurring donation. And make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon to be notified when our videos go live. For now, that's all I had for you. Thank you all for watching, make sure to have a great rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.